Hi there, and welcome to The Artist's Craft. I'm your host, Stacey Cochran, and we have an outstanding guest with us in studio today. Jill McCorkle is the author of 8 previous books, 3 short story collections, and 5 novels, 5 of which have been selected as New York Times notable books. 2 of the stories in Going Away Shoes, her latest short story collection, were included in the Best American Short Stories series. She is the winner of the New England Book Award, the John Dos Passos Prize for Excellence in Literature, and the North Carolina Award for Literature. She teaches at North Carolina State University and lives with her husband in Hillsborough, North Carolina. Thank you, Jill, very much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the new collection is Going Away Shoes. So let's start first by talking about that a little bit. When did you know that you had the right balance of short stories to form this collection?
I actually had more than I needed to form the collection. As is often true, there were a couple of stories that focused on male protagonists, and ultimately they just struck a different tone and didn't really fit. And then I had another short that at the last minute we pulled and threw out. So I like to have more than I need, because then you really can focus on the shaping a collection around what stories have in common.
What was the commonality that you were shooting for with Going Away Shoes?
I think what's going on in all of these stories, well, first of all, it ended up being stories with women protagonists, and they're all in a position of transition. They are all going away in one way or another, or crossing a threshold to a new place. So that would be the common thread.
Now, 2 of the stories in Going Away Shoes were included for the Best American Short Stories series. It's a huge honor. Can you talk a little bit about how you were notified of the honor for Intervention?
Oh yeah, well, Intervention is probably the oldest story in the collection, and I remember specifically I was still living in the Boston area, and I had gone to Sports Authority to get my son some necessary baseball gear, and my cell phone rang, and it was the call. So I was sitting in the parking lot, this busy parking lot outside of Sports Authority, and was just absolutely kind of stunned and thrilled with the news. And then more recently, the story in here, Magic Words, that will appear in the new issue. I got up one morning and pulled up my email and saw that I had like 3 emails in a row, one from the series editor, one from the editor of Narrative Magazine, where it had originally appeared, and I was like, ooh, this is maybe good.
This is good news.
Yeah.
So which is more exciting, to get it via cell phone or via email? Are they both equally?
They were both equally exciting, because it's not the kind of thing you know when it's going to be announced or come to you. So they were both just kind of out of left field.
I can imagine. Well, the guest is Jill McCorkle. The latest book, there's 2 coming out this fall. I want to get to talking about both of them, but the one we're talking about right this moment is Going Away Shoes. It's a short story collection on sale from Algonquin Books at bookstores all across the country, and I guess around the world as well. So let's focus a little bit on some of the stories here in a little bit more detail. Can you talk about the process, or what was the inspiration for Intervention?
Intervention, is a story, you know, obviously about a family intervention, a wife who she thinks later tells the daughter too much about her husband's drinking, and next thing she knows, here comes the intervention. The little bit of an idea that I had for that story that lived in a drawer for quite a few years was the thought that someone would knowingly get into a car with someone who should not be driving and fasten that seatbelt and stay. You know, in my mind, it was a kind of sacrificial suicide almost, you know, and so just I had the image of someone doing that, and then I spent a long time thinking what would lead a person to that place, you know, where you would knowingly and willingly put yourself in that seat. And it ended up being a total surprise to me. It became the story of a marriage and the recognition of sacrifices that had been made for her years before, so that here in their later years she wants to return that favor.
One of the things I'm struck with in that story and in a lot of your work is the balance of humor, and in that story almost a despair that has kind of settled over this older couple. Can you talk about, is that a conscious choice that you make as a writer, or does it depend on just where you're at emotionally when you begin a story? I
think it's a little bit of both. I think I'm someone always looking for what might turn that corner into what's a little bit funny, both as a writer and as a person. You know, I'm often very aware in sad situations, tragic situations. I'm always aware of how people continue to say funny things or do quirky things, and the juxtaposition of the two is what fascinates me as a writer and as a person, because you know, you really are perched on the fence. Do I want to laugh? Do I want to cry? You really want to do both. And of course, ultimately, the sadness of the situation is the real weight. But I'm a big fan of that kind of comic relief that allows a character, allows a person to momentarily look away from what is more painful than you can bear to continue to stare at.
You know, I kind of liken it a little bit to actors who use method acting to get into a particular character's mind, and I think writers who are really activating their imagination that way kind of have to go through similar processes to get into a story. Can you talk a little bit about the mundanity of your writing process? Like, what do you do when you start writing? Are you a coffee drinker? Do you drink tea? Do you write better in the morning, better in the evening?
I would say I would prefer to write in the morning, you know, and in an ideal world. But, you know, juggling teaching and whatnot, and when my children were born, and they're now big children, but when they were really small, I realized one day that if I was going to keep writing, I had to just grab it anytime I could get it. So that's what I still do. Just looking for the opportunity that allows me to sit down and really think. And as you say, to get into the life, the mind of a character, and pretty much walk around with that person in such a way that I'm not consciously sitting there thinking, what would she do now? What would he do now? If I've done my work in advance, thinking about characters, it does come naturally. And when it's not, I know that I need to go back and learn more about these people.
Now, how long does it take to write a typical short story, you know, a 5,000 to 10,000 word short story for you? Is it something that happens really quick, or does it vary?
It really varies. There are a few stories in here that are first person. I almost think of them as monologues, and very often that kind of story writes very quickly. If anything, it's the kind of story that just runs over all the boundaries in the process, and I end up cutting and getting rid of extraneous parts. The more complicated stories in terms of structure, like say Intervention or another one in there, Another Dimension, I spend a lot of time going back in the revision process, because then you have a lot of different parts of the story. You have the different characters who are being focused on, you have different memories and flashbacks, and you're trying to balance the present situation with ones of the past. And so those stories require a lot more revision, or I certainly give them more time.
So do you, in this process, like with Intervention, let's think about that one for a minute, do you go back and add stuff later, or is it more of a process of whittling away what you have?
Usually, I'm someone, again, who's totally indulgent with that first draft. So usually I have put everything I might possibly want on the table. But every now and then there's something missing. I look back over and see that a character is one-dimensional, and so I want to go back in and find something to give that person that might change that portrait a little, complicate it.
Now, talking about scene construction, do you begin with a character? Do you begin with a plot? Do you begin with maybe a theme or a setting? What is usually the thing that you tend to favor?
It really varies. Like with Intervention, it was just this image of the person getting in the car. That would be the rare instance, and especially rare to see the end of the story first. Usually I begin with a line of dialogue or the idea of a character in a certain situation, and then just let it go and see what comes.
Very cool. Well, the author is Jill McCorkle. The new short story collection is Going Away Shoes. It's an outstanding collection. Two of the stories in here were selected for Best American Short Stories, as we said a moment ago. And we've been talking a lot about the writing process. Of course, our audience for these interviews consists of a lot of aspiring writers and published writers and publishing professionals. And I guess whether you like it or not, you have become the master of the Southern short story. And so one question that I have for you is, what is the state of short fiction for young writers who might be watching this? And for students, what do you tell them? What is the state of short fiction in the U.S.?
Well, I have to say, I really think there's a big comeback. For the longest time, I wondered why the story wasn't more popular, given the very short attention span we seem to have these days, and everything's happening so fast. It seems like the ideal form. And this year I have seen more collections coming out, more attention paid to collections. There's so many wonderful short story writers out there actively working. And so I think it's looking good. I mean, it may be that publishers are still going to say, yeah, but are you working on a novel? Because people seem to immediately ask about the novel as if, if you write stories, the natural progression. I don't necessarily think it's that, that there is a progression. In fact, I would say that I find working on short stories a much more complicated process than writing a novel.
Can you talk a little bit about that process in comparison, writing short stories in comparison to writing novels?
Because I love working on a novel too, and I'm right in the middle of one right now, and that's a great feeling to be right in the middle of this world that you've created. But for me, the real challenge of a short story is I like to think that, especially with some of the broader canvas stories, my goal as a writer is to almost feel like I have taken a whole novel and, sort of squeezed the air out of it and compressed it into this much smaller form. And that's my goal as a writer. And the first person pieces, that's kind of a different type of story. But the stories in here like Magic Words and Another Dimension and Intervention and even Driving to the Moon, I feel the bigger work at hand, that I could have just as easily taken the material for some of those and worked it into a broader landscape.
That's a great point, that you're making. I think writing short fiction, you have to, if you're doing it well, you really have to use that balance of emotion in a compact kind of way. And it is, I think, at least for me as a writer, it's a lot more of a challenge to write a short story and have it be good from beginning to middle to end. And it seems like with a novel, you've got more room to kind of play around and figure out the story as you're going along. And I don't want to say more room for error, but there's, I think you're allowed maybe a little bit more loose end than in a short story, perhaps.
Well, at least it feels that way. And for me, with a novel, in the same way you need to get to the end of the novel to then look back over and look at the pacing and the balance. And but with the story, I guess I feel it even more so that until I get all the way to the end, then the real, I get to the end and then the real work begins. Because for me, the revision focus and time to spend thinking and taking apart what you just put together comes into play more with the story than with the novel.
Can you talk a little bit about that revision process? And maybe as a segue, I should mention the new reissue of Ferris Beach is coming out this fall, which is a novel that was originally published in 1990. So talk a little bit about the revision process for writing a novel. So you get the draft done. Maybe you're writing the novel. Are you self-editing less as you're writing a novel than with a short story?
Yeah, I think so. I like to, again, get the whole thing in hand before I really start editing. But Ferris Beach is a great one to talk about editing, because I actually I wrote the rough draft and finished it while pregnant with my daughter, who just turned 21. And so I had the rough draft, and I was very much in the character of the young protagonist, Katie, who's 13 to 15 during the course of the novel. And then when I came back to revise, I had suddenly become a mother. And in that first draft, I was very aware of how one-dimensional Katie's mother is, and how I kept making notes to myself, you've really got to give her a life, you really need to put some blood in her veins. And so I knew I had to tackle her. And when I came back, it was so easy, because suddenly, I was no longer so much in the kid mode as looking at it from a mother's point of view and imagining.
And that's an excellent example of how just living with a project for a while, you grew as a human being, as a mother, and were able to bring that, emotional maturity and growth to play in the character of the mother in Ferris Beach.
Right. I tell my students all the time, there is no substitute for real time. Even in this fast-paced Twitter world that we're in, there's just no substitute. There's no substitute for the amount of time, the couple of weeks you could put a story in a drawer and let it bake.
But now, in contrast to that, you wrote July 7th very, very quickly, your second novel, and it was critically hailed. It was praised.
I did write it very quickly. I mean, I did revise it, but it was a fast delivery. It definitely was.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of writing Cheerleader in contrast to July 7th?
Yeah, the Cheerleader is the first novel, well, actually second novel. The first novel is still in the drawer. I have one of two copies. But it was my lesson in structuring a novel. And the Cheerleader was really a continuation of that lesson. I almost tricked myself into writing a novel, because the first third of that novel is just in these little short snapshot vignettes, memories, almost like mosaics. And I kept thinking, oh, well, eventually maybe they'll become something. And then, of course, you get to page 100 and it's, maybe I'm writing a novel. And so the cheerleader was, I think, self-conscious in a way, because I was learning so much about the process and trying to figure it out. And then with July 7th, I just sort of gave myself this unbridled freedom to just jump in there and try anything. And I had in mind all these different characters of a small town. And it really is my favorite form to work in for a novel. I did it again with Carolina Moon, and the one I'm working on now is another community novel where I have a whole cast of people within a small town whose lives are overlapping.
Can you talk a little bit about point of view in writing these novels? You know, you've got this full cast of characters. You're writing in third-person limited perspective, right? Where you get into the different characters' minds and the way they see the world. Can you talk a little bit about writing and using different point of views, say in contrast to third-person omniscient or first-person, like you're saying?
Yeah, well, I like playing around with the reader being very aware of this person's secret, you know, so the reader has all this information. The reader is the most omniscient participant because there is knowledge about each individual that the other people don't know. And so it's all about the discoveries and what is learned, what is not learned. And that's very satisfying.
Have you read Ron Rash's One Foot in Eden?
Yes, he's such a wonderful writer.
Talk about point of view. It was sort of the perfect synthesis of using a mystery novel or developing a mystery novel around the concept of seeing the mystery unfold from different characters' perspectives.
Right.
It's just very inspiring, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, the guest is Jill McCorkle. The latest books are Ferris Beach, which is a reissue from Algonquin Books, and Going Away Shoes. So what prompted the reissue? How did that come about?
You know, these books go out of print eventually, you know, whatever paperback house, and I was just thrilled. Algonquin has come in and reissued some of my older ones, July 7th and Cheerleader. And so I was thrilled that they brought this one back.
That's exciting. So how was that, you know, for the writers in the audience who might have books that have gone out of print? It's something that I know I've debated and talked about online a lot about what to do with those books. Some folks are bringing them out in ebook format now. How was it something that you kind of pushed for, or your agent pushed for, or was it something that Algonquin came to you and said, let's bring these books back into print?
Well, my agent pushed for it, but Algonquin, you know, very generously had said, you know, when my next book came, that they would certainly reconsider or consider republishing. So.
Well, let's talk a little bit about I was reading Barbara Bennett's biography, and great, it's just a great book on understanding Jill McCorkle. Excellent title, by the way.
I always tell Barb that I'm going to call her on a bad day and say, okay, explain this. What's going on with me? What's going on with me today?
Well, it's an outstanding biography of Jill McCorkle. And one of the things that she, I guess, got you to say is that when you're thinking about scene construction and setting, that you always go back to the Lumberton, North Carolina of your childhood. Can you talk a little bit about your experience growing up in Lumberton in the 60s?
Sure. It's it was just ideal in so many ways because my parents had grown up in the town, and my grandparents had been around a long time. My maternal grandmother had actually grown up out in the country. And so for me, you didn't just see this building, you know, this courthouse here. You got the whole history of what had been there before, and not just, you know, when my parents were children, but when my grandmother was a child. So I felt that I was always seeing the town kind of like overlays or transparencies. You know, I had a sense of my own generation, my parents' generation, my grandmother's. So there was this great wealth of history there. And I lived not far from a wonderful, beautiful old cemetery where I spent a lot of time riding bikes and just reading the histories on the various stones. And so it just then.
How does that shape you as a person? How does knowing that your family has grown up in this location, has roots there, you may not even be aware of it as a young child until you're a little bit older and can process it. How does that shape you? How does it shape your identity?
Well, it really shaped my identity with the kind of knowledge I wouldn't have had otherwise, and it almost felt like a dual life. I lived on the newer side of town near the elementary school where all the friends were, riding banana seat bikes. But I also spent an enormous amount of time with my grandmother, who lived over on the older part of town in the tobacco warehouse district, where still in the summer, tobacco trucks would just be parked and filled, and it smelled wonderful, and we'd go listen to the auctioneers. And my grandmother lived like it was still the Depression. I mean, she didn't drive, and so we'd walk to the store, and she collected everything and made use of everything. And so spending the weekend with her, it could have been 1940, except that we would watch things like Gunsmoke on TV. She had her favorite shows. But otherwise, it was very much an old-timey country life. You got up when the sun came up. You got ready to go to bed at the end of the day. And it's just some of the best parts of my childhood to have known that solitude and this very quiet kind of life. And my grandmother was widowed when she was in probably my age, early 50s. And so she had had more years alone as this self-sufficient person than she had in any other capacity in life. And so she had this enormous vegetable garden, and her whole world just ruled by sunlight, which was a real gift.
It is, I think it's something that in my own life I'm beginning to appreciate more as have my own kids and realizing that my family has kind of lived here, since the mid-1800s. It's fascinating. Well, I think we're coming down to about our last minute here, and I want to ask you just briefly about some of your experiences at UNC Chapel Hill. You had 3 outstanding mentors there, Max Steele, Lee Smith, and Lewis Rubin Jr.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of having those mentors early in your creative writing development?
They changed my entire life. Because I had always written as a kid. I loved it. It was my escape and my entertainment, and I had no earthly idea that you could grow up to do such a thing. And then all of a sudden I'm in a class, and here are these wonderful, socially respected grown-ups, and their whole lives are about writing stories, reading stories, telling stories. And from there, Lee Smith had, of course, been at Hollins when Lewis Rubin started the writing program there, and both of them encouraged me to pursue graduate school, which also was something that had never occurred to me. So I really felt like, I was kind of this floundering sophomore with no earthly idea of what I was going to do, and I felt I just kind of got grabbed by the scruff of the neck and placed over here, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Well, we are sadly just about out of time. Actually, we're a little bit over, but I want to continue this conversation once we roll off the cameras here. The guest is Jill McCorkle. The books are Going Away Shoes and Ferris Beach. They're both coming out here in fall 2009. For all of us here at the Artist Craft, Marnie working really hard in the back, and the folks over in Master Control, I want to thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you. So we're talking a little bit about your experience at UNC and the influence of Max Steele, Lee Smith, and Lewis Rubin Jr. on you. In what different kinds of ways did they influence your writing, the 3 of them?
I think in so many ways, what I got from all three was encouragement at a time when I really needed to be encouraged. And of course, I learned so much about technique and craft, but again, the most important thing was that I had their vote of confidence, and I was not very confident at the time, and that made all the difference, you know, that they believed I should keep trying. And
so let's talk a little bit about your experience after UNC. You went to Hollins University and studied in graduate school there. How did you come to that decision? In retrospect, it was a brilliant decision.
well, it was. I basically, my senior year, I went to Louis Rubin's office sort of prepared to do whatever he told me to do. And I was about to graduate, and he said, well, you should go to graduate school. And, you know, he had started the Hollins program, and he highly recommended it. And so that's exactly what I did. And, you know, it was just a great decision, and a wonderful time to be there, because there were jobs available for someone, you know, who needed to work, and it was just a wonderful small community. So I did the graveyard shift in the library, which was great, because I got to, while getting paid, I got a lot of reading and writing done. And just Richard Dillard, who was running the program then, was just fabulous.
Very cool. Now, after graduating from Hollins, you were married and taught for a year in junior high in Florida, right?
Right.
Now, how did that experience teach in junior high? Because you were writing books at that point,
Yeah.
like The Cheerleader, that was about adolescence, in essence. And I was wondering if there was a connection there, or was it?
You know, it was just a total coincidence, but it was a wonderful experience for me to teach junior high language arts. I gave it to the character in Intervention. I gave her that job because, what a both painful and exhilarating age to observe. There is so much going on in those bodies. And so it was just a real experience to watch and learn, and it was a way to put me back in touch with the adolescence, you know. And I really do think it's such a primal age, and so much of who we end up being. So much happens in adolescence that sort of sets us in one direction or another.
Well, you've said that the emotions that we have at that age are some of the richest emotions to kind of draw on as a means of getting into a character or a story.
Yeah, I really do believe that. I mean, Flannery O'Connor had the belief that a writer by adolescence had what he or she needed emotionally, and I would definitely agree with that.
Now tell us a little bit about your parents. Your dad was a postal worker, your mom was a medical secretary for a local pediatrician, and you said that your dad and your grandmother were both storytellers, and that you considered yourself your dad's surrogate son.
Yeah, I have an older sister, and so there were just the two of us, and so I was the one. I loved to fish. I still love to fish, so I would go fishing with my dad, and was just very close to him. And he was. I often say he was the king of the what if, you know, because, or the if only, because he was constantly coming up with these story ideas, or, you know, imagining something other than what was actually happening. And you know, as a little kid, they were, you know, stories about frogs or fish or things. But as I got older, you know, it was more imagining what it would be like, you know, living in this house or with this family, or imagining what other people experience. So it was, he very much had the mind of a writer.
Would you say that your writing was kind of born there, and that writing, You know, it seems like from Barbara's biography, you mentioned that he could have been a writer. Do you think your career choice was based on, hey, he had this skill, but he didn't become a writer, and you didn't want to see that maybe go to waste?
That may be. You know, I mean, I think as children, we absorb so many things subconsciously, and that may be. I mean, I have thought that because he really did have that mind for a story, you know, or thinking up plots.
Well, the last couple of questions that I have here, I do want to ask a little bit about the state of Southern fiction, specifically the Southern novel. What does a debut novelist from the South have to do to grab everybody's attention?
Well, there are two answers to that question. There's the easy, superficial one, you know, where everybody's looking for the hook, you know. So if you've written a first novel, you know, and you also maybe, you know, are a fire eater, or you know, climb telephone poles for fire. You know, it gets odder and odder sometimes, the hooks people are looking for. But the real answer, I would say, is to write well and to keep doing it. You know, I think that slow and steady and to build on it. I'm very much of the long distance point of view on things like writing. And it's great to have, you know, a break. I mean, I was very fortunate to be published by Algonquin because people had the eye on Algonquin, you know, to see what Louis Rubin was doing. And I was fortunate to be caught in that light. I could have just as easily had a first novel come out with the big New York house and disappear. And then I would have needed to put my head down and write the second one. And I still believe that kind of perseverance. I mean, I think you can go for the flash and what's the, you know, and I've even had people come up to me at a convention one time and somebody said, so what's your hook? What is my hook? You know, and so I don't know. I don't think you have to be, you know, grotesque to be Southern. I mean, I always laugh and tell that when I was in Lee Smith's class, she famously told us that we didn't have to wear tight black turtlenecks and berets and drink bourbon all day to be a Southern writer. And, you know, the South is also changing in incredible ways. So many people who are transient and coming from other places and yet living here. And so for me, it's a constant balance of wanting to hold on to the South in like my town and what it was for my grandmother, but also to acknowledge progression and where my children are. My children grew up in New England, and though they're both here now, you know, it's a very different experience.
So what can you tell us, final question, what can you tell us about your current work in progress? You mentioned that you're working on a novel.
I am working on a novel that takes place again in a small town, and it was so funny for me when they reissued Ferris Beach, because I had realized right before I learned they were reissuing it that I had put a new family in an old house that's in that novel. So I had already come back to a neighborhood and the cemetery, different people but same place. And so it's another really cross-section of small town life and how people affect one another even when they don't intend to.
Very cool. Well, thank you very much, Jill, for joining us in studio today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks. Awesome. I think that's a wrap, Marnie.
Well, thank you. Boy, you had great, thorough questions.
I like to be prepared.
Well, you were. This is fabulous.
Would you mind signing my books?
Oh, I would be delighted. Do you have a pen? Or?
I do. It's in the control
I
room.
may have one here at my...
Be careful with the
Oh,
microphone.
that's right. I've got... Is it Eli or what?
Eli. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I knew when I was putting this question together yesterday, I had enough for an hour-long interview.
Yeah.
And I knew that pacing was going to be a bit of an issue. So what I think I'll do is I'll take the second part that we did there, the burn of the music, and just edit it together and make like a 45-minute long interview for YouTube. What'll air from Wake County, Time Warner Cable will be, what we shot in 30 minutes.
That is a fine length. I already talked to Ed about it, so I was a little bit up to 29, but he said that's no problem. We don't have to cut it.
Yeah, 29's good. It's when we get to like beyond 29, 30 that they can't put in any PSAs.
Oh my gosh, it's 9/11.
Yes, it's also my mother's birthday, so I
Oh,
have
wow.
a good association with it as well.
Yeah, my sister's birthday is November 22nd.
Mine's
So,
birthday.
Yeah, so not a happy 7th birthday for her,
Yeah.
but yeah. Well, I will see you around state.
Yeah, hopefully I won't feel quite as intimidated or starstruck when I see you now.
Oh, I am so eager to just meet, and